Thank you very much, Gawain. Thank you very much for inviting me, for setting this session up, and so for being able to complete this series of talks on the cost of living crisis. It is a small group, so we can have an involved discussion. I've been thinking of how to do it in a way that's interesting and different from other sessions I've done. And what I think I will do is present some data to you, some evidence about where we are with regard to the UK economy, but not talk so much about the cost of living crisis per se, talk about the underlying causes of it and basically where the UK economy is going or might be going. I think this is appropriate in view of the election we've just had. We've got a new government, different set of circumstances, different set of considerations. Of course, we should talk about the cost of living crisis, but really what we should be talking about is where should the UK economy be going in view of the pressure on working people and what has taken place the last few years. So that's what I'd like to do. I've prepared some slides. It's mostly diagrams, and I will tell the story using the diagrams, and I will keep going back and forth, making some slides up here and then taking them off and doing it verbally. I hope it will work. I'll do it for about 20 minutes and then we can discuss. But for that, you might have to make me co-host so I can share my screen with you.
Made you host for now, Costas.
Okay. So let me do my best here. No, that's not right. Font. Ah, there we are. Can you see it? Okay. I'll keep the share function on, but I will move around as I need to. Now, the immediate way of talking about the cost of living crisis, which we've been talking about for some years now, is as inflation, basically, right? Inflation, the rise of inflation, which is undeniable. And let me show you what it looks like here. You can see the consumer price index here, which is the standard measure of inflation. I don't want to get into details, core inflation and so on. This will do. CPI will do. And you can see what's happening here. This is the previous decade, nothing much happening, around 2%, which is the Bank of England target. Then the pandemic hits, prices actually decline, and then they rocket up. CPI hits 10%, and then begins to decline from about 2023, and currently it's around 2%. That's the CPI. That's not core inflation, but let's, again, not get into details unless people want to do so later. That's enough for our purposes. So basically, following the pandemic and the intervention of the British state, and not only the British state, but also the US state, the French state, and a number of other Western states, inflation shot up. It went to levels that had not been seen for a long time. That's really the cost of living crisis from the macroeconomic inflation side. The question that we have to ask is, why did this happen? Why did prices rise in this way, and how have they come down? Because come down they have. The cost of living crisis, in the sense of pressure on working people, has not been resolved. And that tells you that inflation is not the same thing as the cost of living crisis, but undoubtedly the rise of inflation is a key part of it, right? That's why we start with that. So why has this taken place? Well, that's not rocket science. It's perfectly understood and pretty well known. What happened during that time, which is the time that the pandemic hit, and we had that range of extraordinary measures taken to shut down the British economy and a whole host of other economies, was that, of course, a disaster was threatened in terms of economic activity, and governments intervened. The intervention of governments is easy to see, in particular in the case of Britain. It's perfectly clear. So if I show you the government deficit, you can see one leg of the government intervention on the fiscal side. So you can see here is George Osborne reducing the government deficit dramatically throughout the previous decade. This is Tories, the Tories under Osborne fundamentally, right? Reducing the government deficit. Then the pandemic hits and the deficit rockets. As it goes down, it means that it's big. So therefore, the government is spending. The deficit increases. It increased because the government had to spend money in order to shore up the economy. And that was a time when companies were supported with public funds, and the furlough was in operation, and so on. That lasted for a significant time, and then the government began again to reduce the deficit as tightness set in again. But the key thing is this, right? During the pandemic, and as a result of the shock, governments increased fiscal expenditure dramatically, very substantially by British standards or any other Western government standards. That's one leg of it. The other leg of it is, of course, this monetary policy. So exactly at the same time, and precisely for the same reasons, the money supply increased, meaning that the Bank of England, and in Europe, the European Central Bank, and in the United States, the Federal Reserve, opened the tap and began to supply money to banks, liquidity, and therefore the banks began to create money themselves. They had easy access to public money, and on that basis they could lend money themselves and create money as they did that, because that's what banks do. When they lend, they create money. So you can see the incredible jump in the money supply beginning sometime in 2020 goes up to extraordinary levels. Underneath that is the UK Central Bank, the Bank of England. The Bank of England is increasing the money it provides to the economy. The banks then themselves increase the money supply. There's plenty of money in the British economy. So we've got two things. On the one hand, the government increases its spending. On the other, the Bank of England, the government, in other words, with a different hat on, increases the availability of money in the economy, the banks playing their own role in this. Now that's called expansionary Keynesianism, right? Classical Keynesian measures. The British establishment has known how to do that for at least 100 years, since the days of John Maynard Keynes, who basically invented much of this. They haven't been doing it systematically, but whenever a crisis hits, they do it. They know how to do it. So when the crisis hit very severely in late 2019 and early 2020, they did it. And that's when the trouble started. Because making all that money available and spending money by the state on fiscal policy boosts demand. That's basically what it is, right? There's more demand in the economy. So demand was boosted on the state side, and that's what allowed the British economy to survive 2020, because it was a terrible time. You might cast your mind back. And then soon, the upper layers of the British income pyramid also came into the game, because there was the middle class, which had not been able to spend in 2020 because everything was shut down, which had savings put away and had repressed consumption needs, which was also able to begin to spend on whatever he wanted to spend as the restrictions were lifted or loosened. So together with government expenditure, which boosts demand, we also had the better off people beginning to spend again. The boost in demand was significant in 2021. Government-led, with the better off people doing their part for it. When you do that, you better have a supply side, a production side that can deliver. When you boost demand to that extent, you're relying on the production side, the supply side, being able to deliver, to produce the goods, to meet the demand that's coming into the market. And that's what didn't happen. And that's the real problem, that the production side of the British economy, the supply side, is weaker than it's been in decades. There's no mystery why it's weak. I'll tell you about that and we can discuss it. But the problem with inflation started there. Demand was boosted for the reasons that I pointed out. Supply could not respond. And not only domestically in Britain, but also internationally, because the so-called supply chains, the global supply chains that basically connect Britain to Asia and other parts of the world, were disrupted. So as demand was pumped into the British economy, the supply side could not respond in equal measure. Well, there is no prizes for guessing what's going to happen when this takes place. Prices will rise, of course. If demand is boosted, then supply production cannot meet the increased demand, then prices will begin to rise. As soon as prices began to rise, the biggest companies began to make hay, because it's an extraordinarily favorable environment for big business to make extraordinary profits. If there's a general lift of prices, general push of prices up, and you're strategically located, for example, in the energy business, you can make billions. You can begin to manipulate prices, and that's what they began to do. You can also make exceptional profits if, as prices go up, and therefore the value of your output increases, you keep wages down. That is the easiest way to increase your profit margin. And lo and behold, that's what big business did. Across Britain, and not only Britain, France, the United States, Germany, it was a time of very high profits. For workers, meanwhile, as I will show you in a minute, the reverse held. Because if prices begin to go up and your wages do not follow, then you're losing real income. That's basically what's happening. Your real income is declining. It's basically an income transfer away from your own income into the company coffers. The profits that big business makes in those conditions is not a profit that comes from entrepreneurial risk, from investment, or from anything like that. It's a profit that comes directly from taking people's income. It's an income transfer. The poor get poorer and the rich get richer. And that's basically what happened during that time. For the poor, getting poorer means a cost of living crisis. That's basically what's underneath, right? That's basically what it means. You have a situation in which wages have been under sustained pressure for a long time, and then you get a double whammy. You get an extra hit from increasing prices, which are not matched for a period by increasing wages. And therefore, at the margin, for people who are at the margin of survival, and there are plenty of those people in Britain, people who live on a day-by-day basis, right? Just about making ends meet. If you get something like that, you can't make ends meet. That basically pushes you into severe working poverty. It makes you rely on, provision of food by charity, from charity, and so on. The things that we've lived through, the things that we've experienced, the extreme pressure that a lot of British people, working people, were put under. Now, that in a nutshell is, in a sense, the historical fundamental analysis, from my perspective, of the cost of living crisis. A little bit more needs to be said about that now before we generally discuss it. I said to you that the problem was the supply side. The problem in Britain remains the supply side, even if the problem of inflation is subsided. As I've shown you before, here, inflation is not as severe a problem as it was before. But the weakness of the supply side remains. And I want to tell you that story a little bit more. Let's have a look at the production side of Britain and the real problem, as I've indicated to you. Why is the supply side so weak in Britain? Why is in our country, why is production in our country so weak? A thing that everybody knows, right? I talked to a lot of people from different lines of activity. They all agree something is not right. We're not producing enough. The manufacturing side is not strong enough. Industry is not strong enough. Things are not what they should be. How can we grasp that, and what is the easiest way of seeing it? Well, the easiest way is this. Investment levels in the UK are appalling. The problem of the supply side, and ultimately the problem of the cost of living crisis, comes from a sustained absence or shortage of investment in this country for a very long time. Now, this is over a very long period of time, and I've purposely done that to show to you what has been happening over a long time. This is the 1970s, right? This is a long time ago. 80s, this is 1990. Observe what happens since 1990. The level of investment in this country as proportion of GDP, in other words, as proportion of what we produce, has been weak for 35 years. Here it is. You know, I'm sorry, I'm moving this. I don't mean to, but just a minute. Here it is. You can see that it is low. In the previous decade, it dropped horrendously low, to horrendously low levels. It bounced back, but not much. This is very weak investment. Why? Private investment is very weak. Private capitalists, big business, and small business doesn't invest in this country. Investment levels are weak, but government doesn't invest either. You look at general government investment, private investment, the levels are appalling compared to the 70s, 60s, and so on. They declined. This is Margaret Thatcher coming into the game, and public investment has been on a very low level for 40 years. Private investment, meanwhile, has also been very weak for 30 years. That's the source of weakness. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. The reason why the supply side of the British economy is not strong, the reason why the production side doesn't perform to the level to which British people expect, is because British capitalists, private capitalists, but also the British state, do not invest. Now, if you don't invest significantly, and I could have shown you I'll show you some other data in a minute, but if you don't invest significantly, what follows? All sorts of negative things follow. But one negative thing that follows, about which everybody keeps talking now, they've discovered it suddenly, is, of course, that the productivity of labor doesn't rise. I know that when I talk to trade unionists and I mention productivity, they begin to look for their guns. I know, and it's fair enough, right? Because productivity is what management usually talks about, and it's not good when you are a working person. It means not good things are going to follow. I understand that fully. However, capitalism, which is the system we're living under, pivots on productivity, or the productivity of labor. All right, it's built into it. It's a push to increase the productivity of labor all the time, because that's how businesses compete, and that's what brings the change in the world we've got around us. So we've got to look at the productivity of labor to understand how well an economy is doing and what its future looks like. That hinges on investment, because that's how the capitalist economy increases productivity. It might squeeze workers by making them work harder, but that's an inefficient way of doing it. The efficient way of doing it, we've known that for a long time, is to increase investment. That's really how capitalism ought to work, right? And here you see, in the case of Britain, very weak investment. In other words, British capitalism is not actually delivering in the fundamental sense of what it ought to be doing, right? And the result is clear. Look at that. You look at labor productivity, about which so much noise is being made at the moment. right? And you look at the post-2007, 2008 period, that's the critical moment. 2007, the great financial crisis. That's really when things went pear-shaped. You look at productivity growth since that time, it's very, very weak, very weak. And it is also very weak during the times of the fall of the pandemic. It's basically zero productivity growth. You know, productivity doesn't increase in the UK, and there are many factors for it. I don't want to minimize it, but the main one is lack of investment and lack of private and public investment. That's why productivity growth, fundamentally, if you're looking for a single factor, that's why productivity growth is not increasing. Now, you can compare the UK to other key countries in this regard, and it's interesting to do it. This is levels of productivity, right? This is comparing productivity among different countries. The UK is about here, way below Germany, the USA, and France. This has been the case for a long time, incidentally. But look at how the line bends. This is what I'm telling you about. This productivity growth becomes very weak the last 25 years in the UK. It's similar elsewhere, incidentally. The problem, in other words, is a general problem with the West. But the UK is one of the worst cases. And the reason is lack of investment. Underneath this, if you want to generalize, lies the shift of capital to Asia as well. Shifting capital to Asia, taking advantage of the rising productivity of workers in India, in China, and elsewhere. Business moving productive capacity abroad. That's basically what it amounts to. The global value chains are behind this in important ways. So the weakness is that, did the British state begin to do, or the British government begin to do something about this? Did it? Yeah, of course not. What they did was to confront inflation with the age-old weapons that they've got at their disposal. They didn't intervene on the supply side. They didn't do anything to improve the poor performance of British business and the public sector in investment and so on. What they did was this. And it's fairly clear. Here is the bump in inflation that I showed you before, right? That the big hill, the sudden increase in inflation that I showed you before. And here is the base rate of the Bank of England. So early in 2022, the Bank of England began to increase the rate of interest, aiming to bring inflation down. Now, how does that work? Well, it works in the way that you can guess. By increasing the rate of interest, you reduce the scope and opportunity for banks to create money. You make the supply of liquidity to banks less than before. It becomes more expensive, so banks stop creating money, so they stop boosting demand from the monetary side. And by increasing the rate of interest, you also squeeze people's income because you take more income away from them as interest payments on mortgages and on their debt, and therefore they have less money to spend. In other words, you increase poverty and difficulty for ordinary people, and you constrain demand. An important way of constraining demand is this here. The Bank of England played a key role in doing so. The other thing they did was, of course, eventually what I showed you here was to begin to reduce the deficit, austerity, in other words, fiscally. So the government contracts its expenditure, begins to have a lower deficit. The Bank of England increases the rate of interest. Both sides put extra pressure on working people, because if the government spends less on the fiscal side, then the public services get weaker. And if the Bank of England raises the rate of interest, then everybody knows it, because large numbers of people are indebted for mortgages and what have you. And so you compound the cost of living crisis because you add pressure on the disposable income of working people. That's the main mechanism that they deployed in order to restrain inflation. They succeeded. Here it is. It's come down. They haven't succeeded as much as they would have liked, because although CPI is at 2%, core inflation, which is a slightly different concept, remains high. So the Bank of England rate remains at 5.25%, which is very high. So the pressure on working people from the financial side remains very pronounced. But by and large, inflation has come down. The problem of insufficient income, however, remains. It's not as serious as at the peak of inflation. It's not as serious as around that time when prices were going up by 10%. But serious it is, and it is serious because the supply side is not doing well. And if the supply side is not doing well, then if productivity is weak, then real wages will not be rising. So that you can see here. That's the last piece of data I will show you. Here is wage growth, which is now above inflation, but only now, the last few months, because inflation has gone down to 2% and wage increases at around 6%. If you look at the overall path of it, you will see that wage increases are nothing to write home about terribly. I mean, you're basically recovering the levels of increases that we had at the peak of the furlough and the pandemic. And this is basically making good the losses that the British people had in wages the previous decade, which I'm not showing you here. But because inflation has gone down to 2.5%, now real income can begin to edge up slowly, and that attenuates the cost of living crisis the last few months. But the underlying reality remains. The supply side of Britain is weak in an incredible way. Productivity is not rising. The country has got a production side that is evidently malfunctioning. That is the problem that the Labour Party will have to face now. That is what Rachel Reeves and others will have to confront, because that's basically where the difficulties come from. And obviously that involves an entirely different discussion, which we cannot have now, or we can begin to have now, but not get in any great depth into it. In a nutshell, then, that's how I understand. I'll stop sharing this, and I can show you again as and when there is need for it. That's how I understand the cost of living crisis, and that's how we've argued it. In important ways, the pattern can be seen in other European countries, but also in the United States. But Britain is peculiar because of the severity of it. And the severity is pronounced because of the weakness of the supply side. Britain, in some ways, is typical, but also atypical. It's typical in the general trends, atypical in the depth of these developments. That's the last thing I want to say. That has to do with the transformation of the British economy of the last 4 decades. What you saw there is the outcome of 40 years of Thatcherism, basically. A transformation that began 4 decades ago and more. Here we are. A lot of people have done very well out of it in big business and elsewhere. The majority of people have not. And the cost of living crisis was one manifestation of that in a very sharp way. It's not as severe as it was a couple of years ago, but it remains very, very pronounced. And how we will deal with it in the real sense of supply side weakness is for discussion. Anyway, enough said. Let's open it up, and I'm happy to welcome